Georgina, if you're there, please speak.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Hi. Was that perfect timing, or was
That
that
was brilliant timing. Oh my gosh. So I'm going to thank you. And I'm going to, oh, you might want to turn the volume down a little bit, that I could just hear a bit of feedback there, Georgina.
Okay.
But hopefully it's sorted now. I can't hear it anymore.
Okay.
So Georgina Lawton is an author and travel writer and host of Audible's DNA podcast, The Secrets in Us. She has been a weekly Guardian columnist. I can never say that word, columnist. And has featured in many other international publications. Georgina came to my attention when I attended a Women in Travel conference earlier this year. And after she'd finished speaking, I basically hounded her until she agreed to come and speak to us today. So Georgina's is a fascinating story in human terms, touching on so much: denial, love, shame, seeking the truth, honesty, dishonesty, wanting answers, exploration, education. So many different sides to her story. So first of all, Georgina, a huge welcome to our Idea Festival. This is day one. Thank you for agreeing to come along and talk to us. Are you ready?
Yes, I am ready. I was just going to quickly get a copy of my book so I can show people what it is.
I've got a copy.
Okay, brilliant. You've got a copy there. Great. I just wanted to
Can everyone see that? I never know whether it really, when you've got a background on, it doesn't always show very well. Can you see that?
Further away was slightly better, but yeah, I think I can see it. Yeah. Brilliant. Amazing.
So to get us started, what I think would be a really good idea is if you basically take the floor and tell us your story. So I'm going to mute myself and just listen in. And when you've finished, I've got a few questions for you, if that's okay.
Amazing. And just remind me again, Liz, when we're going to hop in with the questions after 15 minutes, was it?
Do you want me to give you a sort of sign?
I'll remember. I just need to have it in my head.
Okay. I'll watch the time. Brilliant.
Okay. So 15 minutes. That was it, wasn't it?
Yeah. 15 minutes is brilliant. Thank you. Off you go. Thanks.
Brilliant. Yes, so thank you so much, Liz, for that lovely introduction, and hello to everybody on the call. It's always a little bit disconcerting when no one can, I can't see anybody, but you can all see me, but maybe it will help me concentrate as I get into my story. As Liz said, she met me at a conference, a Women in Travel conference, and yeah, she asked me to talk a little bit about my book and a little bit about my personal story and how that fed into the book that she was holding up just now. So, as Liz was saying, I'm a travel writer and a journalist, and I write a lot about travel and identity. And I guess the reasoning for that has a lot to do with my personal story, and my personal story has fed into my career, and the two have become very meshed. So to start from the beginning, I was born into a white family. My mum is Irish, green eyes, my dad, blue eyes, my brother, blue eyes, looks like the both of them, and then there was me. And I grew up in Zone 5, Sutton, London, on the borders of two worlds, very sort of calm, very homogenous Surrey, and then kind of also a couple of miles up the road was South London. And growing up kind of on the borders of both worlds, I realised that everything around me was more on the Surrey side, shall we say. So my family was white, my mum is Irish, and she's from the west coast of Ireland in County Clare, and my dad's family is from near Wales. And the school that I went to was very white, and I was the only black person in my year in my infant school. And if you know anything about the area in which I grew up, Sutton, it's actually in between Wimbledon and Croydon. It was once called the most normal place in Britain by a Tory MP who wanted to trial a benefit service there. So demographically, when I was growing up, very white, and then both worlds that I inhabited on my parents' side, Ireland and near Wales, also very white. So of course I had a lot of questions because I don't look white and I don't look like anybody in my life. And as I got older, those questions became a little bit more urgent in their frequency. So I would come home from school, age 5, and I put this in the book, about wanting to scratch my skin because everyone around me in my school was white. And I said to my mum, why am I not white? And look what happens if I scratch my skin, it turns white. And that was one of my earliest memories of racial recognition. And I wrote in the book about how that's actually quite normal. Most children do start to realize that the world is a racially hierarchical place around 5, around 4, but children of color sometimes come to that understanding a little bit later because they realize there's something perhaps negative about being the only one that is black or brown, or even being racialized at all, because, you know, racialization is something that happens more to black and brown kids than to white kids. So what was happening to me was relatively normal, but then obviously the situation that I was in wasn't normal. And my mum would say to me, oh, we love you and we don't have to talk about that. We love you, and you might have inherited your looks from a dark ancestor on my mum's side, on my side. And because I was a child and I wanted to believe that story, that's what I told my friends. Then I went to the junior school next door, and then I had the same group of friends in the secondary school by the time I got to age 11 and 12. And then they used to come on board and defend me as well. So we'd meet new people on nights out, and my friends would come on board and say, no, her family's white. Her family are actually from Ireland. We've known her since she was 6, and this is the story. And it just became this whole story and this whole narrative that was bigger than me. And I'd go home and I would say to my dad, well, what's the issue? What if I was swapped at birth? What if I'm not related to you or mum? And my dad would always say, I love you and you're my daughter, but we don't need to talk about it any further. And it just kept getting shut down. And if you know anything about the west coast of Ireland, where I spent every single summer of my life, you'll know that there were very few black people around there. Limerick and Shannon actually has like a lot more Nigerian immigration in the past few years. But when I was younger, I was the only person that looked like me. But my mum is actually from a small place near Spanish Point. And Spanish Point is a very, very westerly tip of the West Coast. And we used to say that I could have inherited my looks from a black or brown ancestor that was on the Spanish Armada. And that was the story that was used to kind of justify my place in my family. But because I wanted to belong, and because I wanted to attach myself to this kind of Irish mythology in which my whole family could place their roots, that's the story that we leaned into. And it didn't get repeated much, but I do remember it was repeated enough times that I would then go and tell people in school that was the situation. I'm Irish, I'm English, but I might have inherited my looks from a brown person on the Spanish. Yeah, doesn't make sense. And scientifically, I've gone into a lot of research about DNA testing and about how genetics is passed down. There were black and brown people around the time of Henry VIII, around the time of the Spanish Armada, but not enough that they would darken, an entire gene pool in an entire town, and not this much. But I did definitely look into it when I was younger, and again for my podcast, which is all about DNA testing, called The Secrets in Us, which Liz mentioned. So the story, that was the story. It did get increasingly difficult as I got older. And then by the time I got to university, of course, you have to introduce yourself to new people again and again. The story became ridiculous. People that were from other parts of London, people that were from all around the UK were saying, oh, I don't believe that. How could that be true? Oh, have you heard this story? Apparently her parents are white. Apparently she identifies as white. But I didn't have anything else to go on. But by 18, 19, I realized that it didn't make any sense. And I knew that I had to look into it further. But it took me a couple of years of studying at university and making new friends from around the country, more black and brown friends as well, before I decided to challenge my parents. And then by the time I got around to challenging my parents, my dad was actually diagnosed with cancer. So I put it off, and I put it off after I graduated university because it didn't seem like the right time. And he was incredibly ill, and it just, that became more important. But I did have a conversation with him when he was very sick, and I said, Dad, I need to take a DNA test, because when you're not around, I'm not going to be able to move through the world with my head held high if I don't know where I'm from. And this has impacted me all my life, and we're not talking about it. And it's now just getting to the point where I feel quite desperate because I know that you're not going to be around anymore. And again, he looks at me and he said, I know that you're my daughter and I love you. And that was enough. And I didn't pursue it any further because he was terminally ill, and he passed away a year after I finished university when I was 22. However, before he passed away, I did get his permission to take a DNA test, so his sample and my sample. And the first year after he died, I didn't have the strength to process it. But then a year after that, I decided to put the results in the mail and send them off to one of those companies that does DNA testing. And we're all grieving. My mum was grieving, my brother, I was grieving. We're all missing my dad because he was very much the rock in our family. And then to compound that grief and that pain, the results then came back and told me that I definitely wasn't related to him. So the paternity test that I'd had done, there was absolutely 0% probability that we were related. And I remember opening up that email whilst I was at an internship in London in a magazine. It was like my first internship at this big magazine. And I got the email results at my desk at the end of the day. And it was just like time stopped, the world stopped, and I couldn't process what was in front of me. And, there'd been jokes over the years about, my mum's fidelity or about me getting swapped at birth. But I'd never really acknowledged that there could be some truth in that story. I knew that it didn't make sense. I knew that I couldn't move through the world identifying as white, but I also didn't have permission to identify as black or indeed as mixed heritage or dual heritage, as a lot of people like to use that term today. There just was no understanding of where I was from, and there was no pride. The silence was a huge theme in my life, and I think when I was a child I picked up on the fact that nobody was talking about my skin or my hair. Nobody was talking about the possibility that I might have a different parent or I might have heritage from elsewhere. And because that silence became deafening, I picked up on the fact that maybe there was something wrong with me because the silence was related to how I was being described. So I'd never really fully accepted that my dad might not be my dad. And we were especially close, even closer than me and my mum. And when I got those results, it was really devastating. And I went back home, I challenged my mum, and she couldn't admit that the test was correct. She came up with excuses. She said there might have been a mistake. The lab could be wrong. And of course, that just prolonged this huge wedge that had grown between us anyway, and it prolonged all the pain and the grief that we were already in as a family. And then eventually we sat down and my brother said, you have to tell us the truth. Like, we've got to a point now as a family that it can't go on. And she did say that she'd had an affair, I guess, with somebody that she didn't know very long. And it was when we were living in West London, because before we moved to Sutton, my family lived in Shepherd's Bush, Notting Hill. That's where my parents met. So she said she doesn't have any more knowledge of this guy, and she doesn't know where he's from, she doesn't know his name, and she can't talk to us any further about it. So it was like there was a weight that had been lifted off my chest, and then it got semi-replaced because there's no further information about where I'm from. I don't have any information about my genetics, my health. So that was really difficult. And because of that, I then decided to go and make up for lost time and go traveling and go living in spaces where there were other people that looked like me. So as I said, I was from Sutton. I could have just gone down the road to Brixton, but instead I decided to move to New York. And I think I was clutching at the most obvious forms of cultural blackness. And for me, that came in the form of African-American culture. So I booked a flight to New York, age 23, and I was freelancing for a magazine. So I had, income coming in, and I started writing about my journey, about identity, and about how blackness is constructed around the world. I started doing travel writing, and I think the desire to be a travel writer and the desire to see more of the world really came from not knowing where it was that I belonged, not knowing where it was that I fitted in the world, and wanting to see more of that and wanting to gain a deep understanding of what it meant to be a black woman in America, what it meant to be a black woman in the UK, what it meant to be a black woman in the Caribbean. So I went to New York for 6 months, and then I started getting invited on press trips, and I went to Vietnam, and then I thought that I could continue. So I continued and contacted brands and went to all these spaces in which I could see myself. So I went to the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Nicaragua, and I was writing constantly as I was going. I started a blog, which is now defunct, and it was quite embarrassing, but it was enough to kind of help me process what was going on mentally and give me some time and some space to deal with the grief that I was carrying. And I did that for a year. And then after a year, my writing caught the attention of different editors back in the UK. So I wrote a piece all about my story, all about uncovering family secrets, and also about my dad, my amazing relationship with my dad. I think the first piece I did for The Guardian was talking about how I'd grown up in a white family, but talking about the strength of my dad's love and my hair. So when I was going through an identity crisis in my teens, I used to bleach my hair, I used to straighten it, and it used to, in my head, look like Beyonce circa 2005. But in reality, it was a straw-coloured mess. It was frazzled. But my dad used to help me sew in pieces of my hair. And if anyone knows how weave works, you sew in pieces of hair to your own hair that's came road to your head. So I used to go to the hairdressers to do this. And then when I had no more money to go to the hairdressers, my dad would get the needle and thread and he would help me sew in these bits of hair. And he would always say, I don't like doing this, but he would do it anyway. And it was sort of his way of acknowledging that this afro hair had come potentially from another parent, from another paternal figure. But he wasn't going to talk about it, but he could help me manage it. And we didn't talk about where my hair pattern had come from. We didn't talk about why I was dyeing it, but my parents did do their best to help me look after it and help me find products and take me to black hair salons in Croydon to manage it. And it's not high maintenance hair. It's just, we didn't talk about where it comes from and what to do with it until I got to about 15, 16. And my dad especially was quite hands-on with that. So I wrote this piece about my dad's relationship with my hair, and that did really well in The Guardian, and they offered me a column, and I had a column talking about issues that come from being a black person in an all-white space, issues that come from being lied to. My family in particular, I wrote quite personally about that, and I know it was very difficult for my mum to deal with a lot of our issues being, aired online. But for me, writing is a means of understanding myself and understanding the world around me. So I didn't have any other choice but to keep writing to make sense of what had gone on. And in doing so, what was lovely was that I connected with so many people around the world that surprisingly have the exact same story. And you might think that this is a weird sort of issue that doesn't really affect that many people, but I can tell you that from all the emails and texts and Instagram messages that I've had, the shame that's associated with an affair, and especially an affair with heritage or a person of heritage that isn't particularly common in white communities. Like my mum grew up in 70s rural Ireland, and I think having an affair was bad enough, but having an affair with a black man was even more taboo. And there are lots of people in very, very similar situations, lots of people who have continued to uphold their families' lies in order to protect their parents. And in reading my story, they said, okay, I still want to have a relationship with my family, but I'm going to challenge them, or I'm going to take this DNA test. And, which DNA test should I take? And have you found out any more about your heritage? And I kind of became this springboard for people with very similar stories. And that was incredible. And it was also draining, and it was also difficult, but it also made me, I guess, more inspired to continue writing. And that's why I wrote the book Raceless, and that's where it came from. And that's my personal story. So I guess I could leave it there and have Liz hop in and ask me some questions.
Yeah. Georgina, thank you for sharing that. And I'm sure that everybody is feeling the same as I certainly was when I first heard this, and I feel it again now, that it is an incredible story. It's exceptional. And I've got so many questions that I want to ask, but I think I really need to take the opportunity to thank you for sharing again, but also to acknowledge what I feel is such a tremendous bravery that you have in seeking the truth. As you say, many people don't, do they? They manage to get through life without maybe asking the questions that you asked. But when you were grieving for your dad, you were probably angry and loads more emotions. And then you were finally hit with the truth about your birth and upbringing. So I know, and we should acknowledge that you were brought up in a really loving and caring environment, but still your bravery in acknowledging and telling your story, I think, is huge. So I just wanted to say that on a personal level, really, but thank you for sharing it again. So let's go back to the moment of what drove you to seek the truth and start your personal journey. What was the deciding factor or factors for you?
Yeah, there were so many. Like I was saying earlier, it started age 5 when I had these moments of racial reckoning, and it continued when I started to go into more diverse pockets of South London, and people would, chat me up when I was 16, 17. They'd say, oh, what's your mix? Oh, you look Eritrean, or you look Jamaican, or you could be mixed with Indian. And having everybody else's projections of what I am and what they think I am thrown at me at such a young age. As a teenager, you're trying to find yourself anyway, but constantly having to navigate your identity in the shadows of everybody else's perception of you was really, really difficult. And I think that happened so many times. And I was disbelieved so many times when I told them of my story, or when I told them of my parents' story, that all of that added up and just became a sort of insurmountable weight on my shoulders that I could no longer no longer carry. And I guess, yeah, one of the biggest catalysts was going to university and just becoming more cynical as I learned more about the world around me and learned more about the types of friends that looked like me but didn't have anything close to my story, and realizing that didn't make sense.
Yeah. There was one teacher at your school that was particularly awful, and yet that really did also act as a catalyst for you. Do you want to quickly explain about the...
Yeah, I forgot that story. It's in the book as well. It's a reference to when I was studying politics, age 17, and my teacher pulled me up in front of the whole class when we were in the middle of a test, and she said, "Oh, why are you marked down on the school system as white?" And I had no idea that my parents had marked me down on the school system as white, but that's the lengths that they went to not discuss my heritage. And I hadn't a clue. Maybe at age 17, I wasn't identifying as white, but I certainly wasn't proud enough to call myself black. But I didn't know that I was down on the school system as white. And my teacher said in front of the whole class, "What is this?" And I had to tell her my story. And she said, "Oh, that doesn't make sense. What if you're swapped at birth? What if your mum had an affair?" And she started reeling off all the sort of playground insults that I'd heard growing up. But this was a teacher that I trusted, so it was quite shocking and everybody could hear. And it was really painful. It was really difficult. But she also taught me a valuable lesson in that she made me realize that whiteness as a construct is based on these completely false notions of purity. And even though I do have white heritage, it's not going to admit somebody that looks like me into that category. And I can't move through the world expecting it to. So it was a painful lesson, but it was a valuable one. And it taught me, I guess, about the nonsensical aspect of these racial categories.
Yeah. There's so much that I could say about that teacher, and I won't. So for you, what have been the most poignant moments for you after you did discover the truth?
The most poignant moments.
Poignant moments, yeah.
I guess talking to lots of other people who were raised in a similar way as me and interviewing some of them for the book. People have the exact same story as me. There's one guy in the book that I interviewed who grew up as the only mixed person in a tiny town in Wales, and his mum never spoke about his heritage, and he contacted me after reading something in The Guardian about my story, and I interviewed him for the book, and his story was exactly the same as mine, except it was set in the 70s in Brecon, in this tiny town. And then what made it even more strange and painful was that even though he was born a mixed race child and he had no access to his identity, he then developed the skin condition vitiligo. So he was moving through the world as a brown person in a tiny white village. He dealt with a lot of racism, and then this cruel twist of fate, he started to turn actually physically white because vitiligo robbed him of his pigmentation. Right. And now he passes as a white man, and he kind of looks very, very pale skinned, and he doesn't really have necessarily black, facial features or hair. And it just reminded me of, how much defending you have to do as a person of color, because he feels now in his core that he's a black man, but visibly nobody would read him as a black man, but he was born as a black man, and he dealt with what I dealt with, racism and fighting for the truth about his identity and trying to find out more about where he's from. But now visibly he passes as a white man, and it's just incredibly painful, I think, for all people of color when their identity doesn't match up with what they feel they are in their core. And I put in the book, there's actually a very interesting study which shows that people who are misidentified, so maybe they're read as black when they actually view themselves as white, it actually has a weathering effect on your body. Like, it makes you sick, it makes you ill, it puts you at risk of mental health issues. It actually has an impact whereby it's a stressor on your body. And I think a lot of people of color can relate to that. So talking about those issues and dealing with people who've gone through something similar was really profound, really poignant for me.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for sharing that as well. It's amazing. What has been, let's bring your mum into this. What's been the hardest part for your mum?
I think there were several parts. I think coming to terms with the fact that this issue wasn't going to go away. And I think that took her years. Every time I came to her as a 5-year-old or as a 10-year-old, as a 12-year-old, I can imagine that she must have dealt with more and more anxiety about the fact that one day she was going to have to face up to this. But because my dad never challenged her, he just saw me in the hospital and said, "That's fine, we're not going to talk about this any further." They never had a conversation about it, so she tells me. And my dad's friends, I spoke to them for the book, and I said, "Did he ever express any worry that I didn't look like him, or was he ever angry?" And they said, "No, he never brought it up. We never spoke to him about it." So I think having my dad give her that sort of path, shall we say, having him love us that greatly was such an amazing thing for both of us. But to have then your child disrupt that silence that you've curated, I think must have been very anxiety inducing for her. And I think it came between us. It drove a wedge between us for many, many years, because I always felt like she didn't understand me or she didn't want to listen to me. And of course, that comes from the fact that there were times where I asked her for the truth and she would walk out of the room, or she wouldn't help me deal with the racism that went on at home. So even though I did have a lot of love and support, there was a lot of, I guess, neglect around this issue because I was struggling with it. And there were times where we could have discussed it as a family, but we didn't. And I think she also found it really hard when I started writing about everything in public, but that was not a way to kind of get back at her, which I think she viewed it as first. It was just for me to understand and connect with other people and to feel less lonely and to feel less isolated with this issue that plagued me for so long, and to just reclaim my personal narrative. So I know she found that hard. But then when we did kind of have it out in the open, it was, you know, she's got used to it. She's come to some of my events and we did do a lot of therapy together, which I write about in the book. And that was something that she organised and something that, you know, she paid for and made sure that I turned up to because she wanted to put things right, I guess.
Yeah, fantastic. So when you, I suppose this is a natural next question to that. What advice would you give someone going through something similar to what you went through?
I guess I would tell people that if they are on the brink of uncovering a lie or a family secret and they're worried about how their family will take it, they're worried about their place in their family, that you have to put yourself first with things like this. And people, unfortunately, might not come along with you, but the priority is your own mental health and your truth and your sense of self. So if you're worried that getting to the bottom of something is going to upset the apple cart, is going to upset your family members, that may well happen and you need to accept that. But you also need to understand that whatever journey you're prepared to go on, people might need to be left behind. And that's really painful, but they might come to terms with it and they might come back and join you. But if you need to understand something about your heritage or your parentage, you need to go on that journey first and foremost for yourself, and then hopefully other people will join you. But if they don't, that's unfortunately on them, and you've got to leave them in that place while you go on your path of healing and learning, because they might not be prepared to walk alongside you, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. So in other words, be selfish, do what you have to do, and hopefully people will catch you up in time when they're ready for it. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Georgina. So taking the subject from you to the sort of wider issues that you bring up in your book, and you've referred to this already, your hair, which by the way, is lovely, and I've seen you on Instagram and it's amazing. But I know that your hair has been really significant for you in many ways. As you said, your parents took time with your hair. They showed their love through helping you with your hair, and your dad especially. And it was also something that kind of set you apart from your family as well. You've encountered in your travels quite a varied response to your hair at times, and there's a significant and wider issue here, particularly for Black, brown, mixed heritage women, that I think we should all be aware of if we're not already. Why is it such an important part of the conversation on the subject of race? And why is there such a pressure on women of colour to conform to societal expectations when it comes to their hair particularly?
Yeah, I think as we've seen this, you know, civil rights movement way back from 200 years ago starting, we've got so much progress and we've achieved so much, but hair and kind of the idea of being presentable has been something that's been left to employers or left to society to dictate around, you know, Black and brown people's appearance. And I think you can really see hair as an allegory, as a metaphor for oppression, as a metaphor for discrimination. And it's one of the few things that I think it was still allowed to be discriminated against after we've made such progress in other areas. So we've seen lots of people challenge in the past, I'd say 5 to 10 years, dress codes whereby, braids are not allowed in school, or somebody's natural afro is seen as unkempt or untidy. But what is it about somebody's natural state that is unkempt and untidy, whereby you can have a white co-worker whose natural hair is seen as the default, is seen as neat, is seen as beautiful, and we use all these different adjectives in advertisements to foreground these ideas, silky, straight, manageable, easy, and then afro hair is unruly, crazy, difficult. And it's just been sort of embedded in society for so long. And I think it was one of the last bastions of oppression and discrimination that was just kind of coded into society. But we've seen with books that have come out in recent years and campaigns that there's just definitely been a movement to challenge that and to ensure that, a black person in their natural state can be viewed in the same way as a white person in their natural state. But still, the stereotypes persist. I think it's really difficult for some black women to say that they can, have the kind of I woke up like this messy bedhead look, because they are still going to be judged unfairly in the workplace. But we've seen, hair discrimination is now illegal in the UK, and in New York, they were the first state to pass laws against hair discrimination a few years ago. So things definitely are changing, and they're definitely moving in the right direction.
Yeah. And it is so much about that awareness, isn't it? It certainly made me look at our dress and appearance policy at Red Carnation Hotels, and we've changed the wording and we've kind of tackled it head on to try and be more inclusive in it. So I think it's something that definitely we can all learn from. Another thing that we can learn from is around the term mixed race. It's something that you mention in your book. I don't think you particularly or individually have an issue with it, but why should we think first before using it when we have to use that expression or need to describe someone?
Yeah, I think it really, in terms of those people who are mixed heritage or mixed race, comes down to individual preference. For me, it doesn't necessarily reflect the family that I've come from or the way that I move through the world. I've done so much traveling, I guess, and I live in Lisbon now. And being here, hearing the words mixed race in Portuguese, it's not as common as it is in the UK. Similarly, when I travel to America, it's not really the used term. I think there's more of a collective identity in the States around blackness. And certainly that is changing, and we can see there's differentiation between those who have white parents and who are black and those who have two black parents. There's definitely more discussion around that. And I do think it's really useful to have that discussion. And I do think it's really useful to be honest and upfront about, your privileges and your class background and privileges that might have come from your parentage or your university. But for me personally, mixed race, it kind of denotes, foregrounds this idea, like I was saying earlier, that we have racial categories that are pure, like white is pure and pure black now is like a theme that I'm seeing people talk about a little bit more. And if you're mixed race, it's sort of this muddying of two types of blood or two types of categories. And like I said, these racial categories are based on false notions of purity. There's no such thing as being pure white or pure black. And mixed race, to me, sometimes compounds the idea that there's a sort of bridge between two pure races. And I don't like that. But I understand that lots of other people do connect with the term mixed race. But you can see that also these terms don't translate across geography. You go to America, different. You go to South Africa, and if I say mixed race, they'd look at me funny because all the people who look like me are called colours. And obviously in the UK, that word is very taboo. So I think we need to understand different contexts and understand that these terms don't transcend geography, and allow the people who are labelled with them to decide for themselves and to decide what fits, the context, the country in which they're living.
Yeah, thank you. And really so well explained as well. And absolutely the regional aspect of it. It's not just about speaking up and perception. It's a really wide issue. So thank you. Two more questions to go before I throw you to the floor and see what questions we've got coming in. We've got a lot going on in the chat, which you may not be able to see. So somebody else has said, so well explained indeed. Thank you. So there's been quite a trend over the past 5+ years on DNA testing, and I know that you've got quite strong views on this and the companies that do these. Can you explain your reservations about how using DNA tests for ancestral analysis could potentially deny freedom and quality of life for minority groups?
Yeah, so even before that, I guess just the accuracy for minority groups is what's kind of most pertinent. When people like me do these tests, when Black people do these tests, we can get results that can completely skew our sense of self. We can get results that could completely throw us elsewhere. So I know people who are of Nigerian heritage who've done these tests, and it comes back and says they're Ghanaian. For me personally, I did a test and I found out that I'm probably 50% Nigerian, but I say probably because when I did another test, it said I was from Benin and Togo. And of course, Benin and Togo and Nigeria share a border, but these borders, geopolitical borders, are devised by human beings, and they've changed over the course of several years. So that's why it's always wise to do them and take a pinch of salt, should we say, because it's never as accurate as, actually tracing sort of like your family through historical records. That would be the most accurate thing. But of course, for people of colour and for anyone that's been affected by slavery, that's also very difficult to do. So these tests are reliable on a broad continental level, and they're reliable to give you an idea of the part of Africa or the part of Asia that you might be from if you're a person of colour. But for Caucasian people, for white people, the system just has so many more people of that heritage in the database. So for me, when I took the test, it gave me granular detail about where my family was from in Ireland. Like I could pinpoint it almost to the village. Yes. And that was really exciting, but I already knew that part, and I wanted some detail for my Black heritage. And it's just kind of said Nigeria, and it said Benin and Togo, and it said West Africa. And, West Africa, what does that really mean? So I'd say take it with a pinch of salt as a person of colour. And the more that we put our data into these databases, the more detailed it's going to be. But then, of course, like you were saying, and as I mentioned in the book, they can be used for nefarious ends. There's like worries that, police have access to these databases. And in America, there could possibly be a future whereby people are denied health insurance based on the fact that they can check your genetic information. All of this stuff is going to impact people of colour more negatively. So I would say be aware of the potential lawsuits. The potential issues around law enforcement and kind of accuracy with the tests as well.
Yeah, such a good point to make. It really is, and it would certainly make me think twice. I've not done a DNA test, but it would make me think twice if I was thinking about it even. One more question, Georgina. Thank you so much so far. We are quite a diverse employee population in TTC. We're spread globally, employing many people, including those from underrepresented groups across many different communities. We do monitor how we perform as an employer on our diversity, equity and inclusion pillars and values, and we try to ensure people can be their authentic selves. We're working hard. We're definitely not perfect. What advice can you give us on our journey as an employer to ensure we're constantly moving in the right direction, helping all individuals, all communities? And I guess the advice has got to be pretty generic here and global, but what advice can you give us?
Yeah, I get asked this a lot, and it's difficult because as a freelancer, I'm not always immersed in sort of office culture. But when I was working in offices, and what I'm seeing now is happening is, a lot more schemes around hiring people of colour from, different backgrounds, having diversity schemes, having positive action schemes. But what I've noticed and what my friends tell me is that a lot of them are for entry level, and that things don't seem to change that much as you move further up the the work hierarchy. So I don't know if it's possible, but having more schemes that come in from a top level, having, action programs that try and target mid-level managers and CEOs, because what seems to happen is that, companies have these great big ideas and we end up bringing in Black and brown people on an intern level and kind of like a one up from that. But after that point, things don't seem to change. They don't seem to move in the right direction quick enough. So that's something that I think is quite important. And also having these days, not just for Black History Month, days like this, festivals like this, but having them more regularly, and not just devoting 1 hour per year to having a discussion about race and inclusion, but actually making it a part of the culture, speaking to other people who are Black and brown, who are ethnic minorities, about how to improve the work culture, and making sure that it's not just on their shoulders to sort things out, but getting people involved who actually have the structural power to make a difference in the workplace. So often I see these kind of festivals and Black History Months just run by the 2 Black employees who are kind of not very high up in the company anyway, and it should be the responsibility of everybody to get involved. And there should be more kind of interest from all levels of the company to make sure these days go ahead, and to make sure that they don't just go ahead once a year.
Absolutely. Thank you, Georgina. And yeah, tokenization is also something that we're going to be talking about later on in the week, which is really, really good. God, you've covered so much and you've just answered so authentically. Thank you very, very much. I am now going to open this up to the floor. I don't mind if people want to put their hands up or put a question in the chat line. You're getting some really lovely comments.
Yeah, I can see them now. Thanks everyone, that's nice.
Emma's heard you for the 3rd time now.
Hey Emma.
So has anybody got a question for Georgina? And thanks, Eddie, for putting the book in the chat line as well, so people can access it and go and buy it. I'm just giving people a moment. Or somebody could put their hand up if they wanted. Oh, so somebody's commented on your ring, Paula Carroll from Ashford Castle. So this is we've got a hotel in Cong, County Mayo.
Okay, nice.
And Paula there has said, a truly inspiring discussion from a highly intelligent, beautiful lady. Thank you, Georgina, and love seeing you still wear your,
my ring, yeah.
Yes, yay.
Well spotted, yeah, well spotted. My mum actually got this for me for my first communion, so I've kept it.
Right, that's lovely.
School, so I can see one question that says,
yes, from Kira. So do you want me to read it out? I'll read it out so everybody definitely knows. So Kira Fitzpatrick, thank you very much. Georgina, your story is incredible. Thanks for sharing. Can I ask how your relationship with your family is today? Your mum, your Irish relatives, your Welsh relatives?
Yeah, so I guess interestingly, it's improved a lot with my mum after we went to therapy, after she made the effort to understand why she'd made those decisions and made more of an effort to understand me as her daughter. And we had to go every week for nearly 2.5 years and listen to each other speak. And at first it was very painful. And there were times that I walked out of the room, that she walked out of the room, but we had a therapist that helped bring both of us back together. And that's done wonders for our relationship, to the point that now it's not, the overarching theme between us. If there's an argument, it doesn't come up and it doesn't get raised, and that somebody will throw something really painful and horrible back in the other person's face. It's always going to be an issue that I have to deal with first, because I still don't know much about my parentage or my genetic history. But we've got to a point where if I need to speak about it, it won't end up in a furious argument. So that's progress indeed. But then interestingly, there's been backlash from some of my mum's sisters and brothers back in Clare. They weren't happy when I wrote an article about growing up with Irish heritage and dealing with racism in Ireland. And they put it down to the fact that I used a photo of me with my grandfather, who passed away for a long time. And they said, oh, we don't like the photo that you used. You've depicted our family as, poor, because it was a picture on the farm. And that, to me, kind of didn't make much sense, and it seemed to be, I guess, a springboard for the wider issue of they didn't like me airing my dirty laundry in public, as they saw it as their dirty laundry. But I don't have my mum's surname, and it's very hard to identify who is who, and my mum comes from one of 7, so I do think it was just more of a scapegoat issue. They just didn't like me talking about race and racism in Ireland, and that's quite sad, because now my mum has then started to defend our family and my decisions to them, and they haven't spoken for a couple of years as a result of that. So I didn't see that coming, because I don't really talk about my relatives in Ireland at length in the book, and there's a lot that I haven't mentioned in terms of my mum's upbringing and my relationship with my mum. In order to protect people, when you write a memoir, it's very exposing, and you do have to think about how it's going to impact other people. And there were things that I wrote and there were things that I took out, but this piece that I wrote in the Irish Independent or the Irish Times wasn't particularly exposing for my family. It was just talking about the experiences that I'd had in Clare growing up.
Right.
And they didn't like that. So that's really interesting that that's now become a bigger issue in the family.
Yeah, that's really sad. I'm sorry about that, because that is divisive, isn't it? And just refusing to talk about it is not helpful either. I've got a question from my very own Emma Mackey, who's put her hand up. So Emma,
I like my very own. That's quite nice.
I'm going to let you. There you are. Off
Hi.
you go.
I do have a question. Well, do you know, well, I guess just to comment on like your story and the book and some things. So obviously being someone that's mixed race myself, there's so many things that come out in this story that are things that I've dealt with in my life, but not obviously from the same lens as you, because I know both of my parents and it's very clear what my racial identity is. But something that I thought was really interesting was you saying, you know, you would go out and people would ask, you know, like, what's your mix, and having everybody else's sort of predictions on what you could be, which is something that I get very often. It's not something that really affects me. I just brush it off. But I was wondering, now that you've come, I guess, discovered a little bit more about your racial identity and what that means to you, how do you face that sort of question and those predictions now?
I find it difficult still to just summarize my story when people ask me where I'm from. So I will kind of give an abbreviated version and just say, oh, my mom's Irish and my biological dad was Nigerian, but my dad that raised me is English. And people say, oh, was he your stepdad? And that kind of stings a little bit, because my dad wasn't my stepdad. He was, for all intents and purposes, the father that I will always call a father. But that's the abbreviated version that I give people. But I do get a lot of comments about not looking Nigerian or looking more East African than West African. But then that comes from, I think, a place of ignorance, because when you are dual heritage, when you do have heritage from multiple places, you can end up looking multiple ways. And I don't mind also when I go back to the UK or the US being called mixed race or, you know, biracial or whatever it is. But as I was saying earlier, for me, those terms seem to essentialize the ideas of race a little bit more. I don't find them offensive, but I wish we could move forward and do away with them. But I think the way that society is moving, there's more mixed race kids being born in the UK than any other country in Europe. There's more interracial relationships in the UK than any other place in Europe. And mixed race is the fastest growing ethnicity in the entire UK. So the way that these conversations are going, I think mixed race is not a term that will be disappearing anytime soon. I actually think there'll be more discussion around mixed race identity. I think it will become more of a category. And I don't think that's harmful. I just think we need to be aware of what that does in terms of essentializing these concepts of race, you know, having a pure white race and a pure black race, and then having us as the muddied mixed bloods in the middle. I think that can be quite dangerous. But until we come up with different terminology, I think it's something that we're all going to have to continue to identify with on some level, I guess.
And I hadn't thought about it like that before. I hadn't thought about the purity element of it before. And I was sitting there thinking, oh, that does feel really gross as a concept, to have like pureness of a race. But thank you for answering my question. That was very nice.
Yeah, no worries. And also around kind of these conversations about gatekeeping cultures, I think we can see maybe more online that there's discussion around gatekeeping whiteness and gatekeeping blackness. And this comes at a point where we're moving forward in terms of discussions around identity in general, but there's always going to be a pushback from both sides, from people who want to defend what it means to be a purely black person or a purely white person. And I think that's harmful from both groups. And then obviously if you are a combination of those two elements or a combination of multiple heritages, it kind of begs the question of like, where do you belong and what are you supposed to say? And that's a stereotype that people love to throw at mixed heritage people. Like, you don't know where you're from, and it's this tragic mulatto, but it can be quite tragic for people that know everything about their heritage. Like, people have contacted me and said, I can relate to your story on so many levels, even though I know both of my parents, or even though I've never been lied to. So yeah, it's like you were saying, it can be tricky, I guess, even though you do know where you're from.
Thank you,
yeah,
Emma.
I completely
Great
agree.
question. Thank you. Claire has asked, I've got questions coming in thick and fast now, so I'm going to go really quick. Claire says, as a journalist, truth should always be key, but has your own experience changed the way you work?
Oh, great question. I don't know so much if it's changed the way I work, but it's definitely changed how I form relationships. I think I'm a lot less patient for people that withhold the truth. I'm a lot less patient for people who enjoy bamboozling others with fancy language. I'm always trying to get to the heart of the meaning and try and work out exactly who somebody is in their essence and in their core, because I'm quite afraid of being lied to again, or not working out things quickly. And it's made me a bit more indecisive. I'm always constantly weighing up, is this the right decision for me, whether that's a career decision or a personal decision. I think I've struggled a lot in the past few years with being decisive and making sure that I make decisions that I'm not going to regret, because for so long I did take the people around me's word as gospel, and it's just made me question, I think, what the truth is a little bit more in general.
Yeah. So it potentially has made you better at what you do. I think that one of the reasons that I enjoyed your book so much is because you get to the nub of the matter, for me, really clearly. So you definitely have a knack for that. Getting to the truth, in other words.
Right.
Karen says antique values and ethics are so hard to understand in our modern world of Western world freedom, and never to hide truths with young children. Fundamentals of life is being true to loved ones and never lie. It can damage a child for life. That is so very true. Thank you, Karen. That wasn't a question, but it was worth saying.
Yes.
And Magda says, thank you for sharing your story, Georgina. How did you decide which part of your story to share, knowing that your family might be hurt?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge for anybody who writes personally, for anybody that writes nonfiction or writes memoirs, or even, as journalists that talk about their family background. As I was saying before, you have to go on your own journey and worry second about how it's going to impact other people. But I would definitely advise people not to write from a place of anger, to actually process what they've gone through first, to actually understand a little bit more about what's happened in their lives before they go and put pen to paper, before they go and put something on the internet that you can never take back, before you go and send that email. Nothing good comes from anger generally, in my opinion. So I took a long time to travel and to grieve and to get my head straight before I wrote things online for outlets that, will never delete them. There's definitely a couple of things that I regret that I wrote at 24 that are still online, but nothing that, keeps me up at night. And that's because I did try and process my own grief and my own feelings before I described and wrote about my mom and my family. But it's still a battle. There's things that I wish that I put in the memoir that are now, too late to put in. The book's already come out. So I would say take the time and take the time to do it, and then decide what goes in it, but also make sure you put yourself first.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Ariana, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I would. Hi, Georgina. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so privileged to have you and hear your story. I wanted to ask you, so similar thing happened to me. I didn't find out my heritage until my father passed. My mom and dad, my father had amnesia, so he just made things up. And I wasn't in touch with my father's side of the family, so I didn't know how strong of a heritage we have. And I didn't understand that because my mother didn't really celebrate that. And so I missed out a lot, and I still miss out daily. I have this very strong Polish and Slovakian family. And I have, they send me nice things for Christmas that are very traditional that I've never experienced. And I'm wondering, the same thing happened to my best friend who was raised by her white mother and never engaged really with her Black side of the family. Do you feel that there are culturally things that you missed out on? Or I know that with your DNA, it's kind of like, oh, maybe I'm this or that, or, but are there very specific things that you kind of feel like almost that you don't get to belong to that culture because you didn't grow up in it, or you don't get to identify as that because it wasn't such a prevalent thing in your childhood?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for anyone that's missed out on the truth around their heritage or their parentage, it's just such a sense of loss that stays with you, unfortunately, for most of your life, because you can never catch up with those cultural experiences that your friends have had. You know, learning about where you're from is a process of cultural osmosis. Like, it just comes naturally when you have two parents that really imbue you with that pride and that knowledge. It comes from learning about the foods as your parents cook them. It comes from them talking about where they've come from and their own childhood stories. And if you've never had that, or if you've been lied to, then that's a loss. That's something you'll never get back, unfortunately. But you can try and make up for it, I think. And obviously taking the DNA test gave me permission to feel proud about identifying as Black, but it's also been quite difficult because I have the specificity now and I have a country, but it's not something that I learned about growing up, and it feels slightly forced. It feels slightly weird to suddenly say that I'm gonna, you know, start cooking jollof rice and fly over to Lagos and start doing travel, you know, articles over there. One day I think I will, but still now it feels like a bit of a strange decision because I don't have a family member to do it with. I don't have that sort of cultural osmosis that happens naturally for other people. I would say that if you do have the knowledge of self, if you do know where you're from, you don't need to ask permission from anybody else. You've been denied something that wasn't your fault. I've been denied something that wasn't my fault. I don't need to ask people's permission if I can identify as Nigerian. Like, I have the information. It's down to me when I claim it, and it's down to me how I claim it. But it's still very painful. It's still something that doesn't come naturally. It's still something that some people will scoff at and say, oh, you're not really Nigerian, you don't look it, and you don't know about it, and it's like, okay, whatever. But I think I've found some solace in the story of other African Americans, because, you know, so much of African American culture is defined around not knowing the specificity of your Blackness. And I think Blackness has been such a huge cultural export from the US because of that. And it's something that when I was 22, 23, I was leaning towards. It's the most visible, the most obvious, the most famous, I guess, definition of Blackness, you know, being African American, being a Black American. So I think that's why I leaned towards that when I was younger. And it definitely comes from, you know, similarly a place of loss, not knowing where you're from and forming this collective identity based on that lack of knowledge. I think a lot of Americans have reached out to me and said that they can relate to my story in that sense, which is interesting. And I didn't think about that when I was writing it, but weirdly, that is why I was probably drawn to New York. And I'm actually going to New York tomorrow for the first time since being there at 23. So I'm really excited because now I might be able to see my book on the shelf, and I might be able to, you know, meet people that have connected with me online. And it's sort of coming full circle, which is nice. But yeah, it's still a work in progress, finding out where I'm from. I know where I'm from, but it's still very much kind of like down to me to claim it and work through it. And I think that will always be something that I have to deal with.
Thank you, Georgina. Thanks, Ari. Lovely question. You will get there. You will get there. Thank you. I think we'll call it a day there. We've had some great questions. You've answered them superbly and so honestly. It's really been an honour to help showcase you and your story today, Georgina. I'm so delighted that you joined us. So please keep up the brilliant writing, the travelling, all the work that you do. Your insights help so many of us gain more understanding of race, identity, and so much more. So thank you. And I would definitely recommend the book, Raceless, and the podcast, The Secrets in Us, to everyone here today. But thank you so much for your time, and thank you for letting us get to know you a little better. It's really appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for all the great questions, everyone, as well.
We will speak soon, no doubt. So thank you everyone for joining us today, whether you were able to join us live or you're watching on the recording. I want to also thank Brett very much for joining us earlier, Vicky Tolman, Annalisa, our remarkable co-chairs, and Nina, Ariana and Jose for sharing their experiences and passion, which in turn led each of them to become a champion of IDEA. So one of the main aims for hosting this festival is to showcase what we've created here in the hope to inspire and motivate more members to join the committee and our circles, and overall to promote education around this really important topic. So please, please join us again tomorrow when we're talking about allyship, TTC's bright idea, coming out and Cultivating Inclusive Behaviour, hosted by the brilliant Ariana. So see you all tomorrow. Thank you all so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Liz. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.